Hi friends, welcome to the last week of school before Christmas break. Fourth grade, we miss you being in person. And fifth graders who are at home, we miss you too. So we've read silly stories, but I have a more serious story. It's a true story. This is the real account of the Christmas truce of 1914 called Shooting at the Stars by John Hendricks. Now, this is a story of something that really happened. In 1914, World War I had just begun. Now, I'm going to read you a little bit of background about World War I that starts off the beginning of this book. And it says here, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." That was from the Christmas carol, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day" by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. 100 years ago, a horrible war began. It was the biggest conflict the world had ever seen. Journalists would call it the Great War, but it wasn't great at all. It was dreadful. Today we call it the First World War. An entire European generation was destroyed fighting a war that ultimately produced very little. Even a century later, the causes of this terrible war are identifiable, but they're dramatically insufficient, considering the ghastly price of over 37 million civilian and military lives. 37 million people. The war was built on national pride and political glory, and even more tragically, it was completely avoidable. The war involved two opposing forces or armies. The armies were not just a single country, but a collection of nations called an alliance. The conflict arose from the Central Powers that were Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey, fighting the Central Powers. The Central Powers were opposed to the Triple Entente, which was the alliance between France, England or Great Britain, and Russia. The Triple Entente eventually called for help and became the Allied Powers, and the United States joined in the Allied Powers. The opposing forces in this massive conflict were the victims of their own alliances that were designed to prevent war by strengthening the response to attack. But in the case of the First World War, the complex alliances actually made the war more likely. They were precariously designed like dominoes, and the smallest push on one country sent all of the countries tumbling into war. As the dominoes began to fall, millions of young men signed up to join the war in the late summer of 1914, and many assumed that the war would be a short adventure and would be over by Christmas. By the fall, the fighting had turned nasty. Technology advances of each army meant that there were weapons like machine guns, and the armies stagnated, stymied by mud, and the soldiers dug trenches in the ground to strengthen their positions, and the close quarters of the battles meant that often less than 100 feet separated the front lines from each other. A bitter winter arrived in northern France, and the reality of a prolonged war set in. Every man on the front, no matter his uniform, was cold and fearful and without hope of returning home anytime soon. And although these soldiers were at war and spoke different languages, the English, French, and Germans shared much. They shared faith and songs and a deep love of Christmas. And this is the true story of what happened one Christmas. It was a cold winter evening in France in 1914. And here's a letter that the soldier's writing. And he says, "Dearest Mother, thank you so much for your last letter. Your words are a rare comfort to me in my cold trench. I so wish to make you proud and serve my beloved England with honor. But life in this foul pit is very trying. Was I really finishing school only a few months ago? We've become stuck in the same spot since October. They say it may start raining again tomorrow." He drew a picture of what the battlegrounds look like, and here are the German soldiers in their trench. And this says this is 30 paces, meaning 30 steps. And then here are the English and French soldiers in their trench. Rain means more mud. The mud here is like none I've ever experienced. When it rains, a thick, loamy foam churns up from the ground and fouls everything we own. The mud I remember from our garden is beautiful in comparison to this wretched stuff. In some places, it's 3 feet deep. I'm not sure how anyone can fight a war in these conditions. We spend most of our time and energy trying to stay warm and dry. When the artillery finally stops for the evening, that's the bombs, It's time to fight the rats for dinner, which is usually cold beans. The only place to eat and sleep is in the bunkers, and when it rains, being inside, is miserable. It's very cold today. Clearly, our hopes of the war ending by Christmas have faded. But Mother, I must tell you something that happened. The tale so wonderful you can hardly believe my account. Christmas Eve was quieter on the line than usual, and we all hoped for a day without shelling, or the bombs. The drastic cold that rolled in 2 days ago became an unexpected blessing. The hard frost turned the mucky mud trench back to solid ground. We had a few hours of sure-footed steps around our meager home. After the sun went down, we decided to chance a fire outside the bunker. But when we stepped outdoors, we heard the sounds of singing. I looked down on the line to find who was foolish enough to give away his position to the enemy. But the noise wasn't coming from our trench at all. I cautiously stuck my head over the edge of the trench, and I couldn't believe what I saw. The Germans, our enemy, was singing. Not only were they singing as loud as they could, they were singing a song that sounded like Silent Night. But all along their lines, there were Christmas trees lit with candles. Several of our boys suggested taking shots at the trees, but most of us were just really glad the Germans weren't trying to shoot us. We wondered where they got all the trees. We went to sleep astonished. Fritz, that's what we call the Germans, sang all night, it seemed, but this was nothing compared to what the next day would hold. Once the sun got over the horizon, we saw the Germans hoist up a banner on the back of an ammunition crate, I think, and it said, "Merry Christmas." And then came a voice that said, "Hello, English soldiers, where are your Christmas trees?" Followed by great laughter from their trench. We could hear everything, for they were only 30 steps to the east. Rifleman Tapp, who has a great arm, took several cans of pear jam and heaved them into no man's land, the open battleground between the trenches. Very near the German line, one of their officers poked up his head. He saw the jam, and then he stood up, waving at us. He wanted us to come up as well. Most of us thought this was surely a trap. But before we knew we could do a thing, our Lieutenant Lovell had made his way through the barbed wire and was walking out to meet the German officer. They met and shook hands. Perhaps an angel of the Lord was among us today. What else could create a spontaneous peace but the hand of God himself? The lieutenant signaled for us to come out. I didn't know what was happening, but it wasn't war. For one glorious Christmas morning, war had taken a holiday. We met along the small ditch in the center of no man's land. The first thing we did was bury our soldiers who had been killed. They were everywhere at our feet. It took some time to finish the grim task. I helped a German officer bury a very young soldier. He was about my age. We lashed together crosses, and our second lieutenant, Graham Collins, said a short prayer. Then we all shook hands and wished one another, a Merry Christmas. I can hardly describe what it was like here. We were talking with men that we were trying to kill just the day before. A few of the lads had brought pocket cameras from home, and so they took pictures together. I traded buttons from my field coat for a belt buckle with a German soldier named Karl. There was also much trading of biscuits and puddings. We had our fill. There were 2 soldiers in such a good mood that they started kicking around an old biscuit tin, like a football, using 2 battered tree stumps as the goals. Karl said to me, "Why can't we just go home and have peace?" We spent most of the afternoon out there, Mother. It was a beautiful day. When the evening came, we made our way back to the trenches. Many returned with souvenirs like I did. Everyone was jealous of Bruce Coy, who traded his helmet, with a German helmet with a pointy top. We sat up on the edge of our trench and we laughed together. It felt like I was back at school. No sooner had we got back than Major Walter Watts came bounding in from the rear trench headquarters. He was furious. He ordered us to load our weapons and be ready to fire on the German trench when he returned. He said we'd acted like traitors to Britain, but how could a day of peace be treason? The major was angry that we'd befriended the enemy, but they didn't seem like the enemy today. Altogether, it was a splendid day with our foes, and tomorrow, I suppose we will all fight for our countries. But when the Major returns, we will have to follow his orders. I suspect that our side will spend the rest of the night aiming high above their trench, shooting at the stars. Merry Christmas, Mum. Love, Charlie. December 25th, 1914. Good night, English soldiers, said the German line. And that is the end of the story. They have some more information about the picture, and there's a real picture of the soldiers that this really happened to. And they did have to go back to war and to fighting each other for 4 more years, and many lives were lost, and it was ultimately a sad story. But for that one Christmas night, the power of Christmas and humanity and love took over, and they celebrated Christmas together, even in the middle of a war. I miss you all. I love you. I wish you a Merry Christmas. We'll see you when we get back.